Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into some brand new research, hot off the press. It was just accepted for publication in the Medical Science Educator Journal.
Oh, wow. Congrats to the authors.
Yeah, big stuff. Especially for folks interested in how we train new doctors, right?
Sure.
And this study looks at something really important, role models in med school.
Hmm.
And it asks this question, do medical students from underrepresented ethnicities, we call them URiM,
Yeah, URiM.
do they see role models differently?
Interesting.
Do they even have the same access to role models who look like them? It's a question a lot of people in medical education are thinking about these days.
You're absolutely right. It's such a relevant topic. And I think what I appreciate about this particular study is that it goes beyond just saying representation is good. It actually digs into the data,
Yeah.
to really try to understand what's going on.
Love that. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, you mentioned URiM. For those who might be new to this, can you quickly clarify what URiM actually means in the context of this study?
Absolutely. In this study, which was conducted in the Netherlands, URiM refers specifically to medical students with a non-Western migration background,
Okay.
which means they included individuals with origins in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Turkey.
Got it.
But here's where it gets interesting. The researchers actually excluded individuals from Indonesia and Japan from the URiM category, grouping them instead with Western backgrounds.
Interesting.
And they did this based on socioeconomic and cultural factors. It's not just about your race or ethnicity, right?
yeah.
It's really about your cultural background and how that might actually influence your experiences as a med student.
Okay, so we're talking about Dutch med students here, but with this nuanced understanding of what underrepresented really means in that specific context.
Exactly.
So important to keep in mind. Now, we've got the who, we've got the where. Let's talk about the how. What makes this study so different from the typical role model research?
Well, one of the most fascinating things about this study is the approach they took to understanding the whole concept of role modeling. They didn't just create a checklist of ideal doctor qualities and call it a day. Instead, they actually developed this really intricate four-stage conceptual framework
Oh, wow.
to break down the process of how medical students connect with, learn from, and are influenced by their role models.
Okay, I am so intrigued. Paint me a picture here. Let's say we've got our first-year med student, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed,
Yeah.
walking the halls of the hospital, maybe a little intimidated too. What are they going through in each of these four stages?
Okay, so picture this. Our eager med student is observing everyone, doctors, nurses, anyone in the medical field, taking it all in. And this first stage is called idealization.
Okay.
This is where they're picking up on those qualities they admire, maybe even the things they don't like, and they're starting to form an image of what they think a good doctor looks like, how they behave.
I see. So it's not about finding that one perfect person right away. More like they're gathering inspiration from all these different people they encounter.
Exactly. They're creating a mental image, a composite, a prototype, if you will, of the kind of doctor they might want to become.
Ah, okay. So they're building this picture of their ideal doctor. Then what?
Well, then we move to stage 2, social comparison. And this is where our med student starts to hold up that ideal image to themselves. They're asking, how do I measure up? Can I see myself doing what they do? Do I even want to be like them?
Oh, this is such a critical point, right? Because this comparison could be motivating, but it could also trigger all those doubts, all those feelings of imposter syndrome that, let's be honest, plague a lot of med students.
Yeah, and not just med students. I think we all go through that at some point in our careers.
Oh, for sure. We've all been there. So how do they get past those comparisons? What's the next step in this role model journey?
That's where stage 3 comes in, and it's called composition. And here's where it gets really interesting, because it recognizes that role models aren't these static, one-dimensional figures.
Right, they're real people.
Exactly. So in this stage, our med student is taking all those idealized attributes, those bits and pieces they admired from different people.
Yeah.
And they're starting to create a more dynamic, even evolving mental image of the perfect physician.
Okay, I like this. It's like they're assembling their own personal justice league of medical awesomeness.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, they might take the communication skills from one doctor, the surgical precision from another, the research passion from a third, and kind of blend it all together.
You've got it. They're building their ideal, taking inspiration from multiple sources.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
But, it can't all be fantasy, right? Eventually, we have to see how all this role model gazing actually plays out in the real world.
Absolutely. That brings us to the fourth and final stage, outcomes.
Outcomes.
And there are two types, behavioral and symbolic. Now, behavioral outcomes are pretty straightforward. It's about learning by watching, picking up clinical skills, adopting effective communication styles, basically imitating the good stuff they see their role models doing.
Makes sense.
But then we have symbolic outcomes, and this is where things get really powerful, especially when we talk about URiM students and the importance of representation.
Right, and I think this is where it gets especially thought-provoking for our listeners, too. Because if you're a med student from an underrepresented background, seeing someone who looks like you, comes from a similar culture, succeed in medicine, I mean, that can be so incredibly inspiring.
It can be a game changer.
It sends the message, I belong here, I can do this too.
It's about shattering those limiting beliefs,
Yeah.
especially for students who maybe don't always see themselves reflected in the faces of those who've traditionally held those positions of power in medicine.
So true. Okay, so we've got this really insightful framework that captures the nuances of role modeling. But what did this study actually find about those URiM students in the Netherlands? Did they actually find those inspiring role models?
Well, the first finding was a little bit of a surprise. It actually goes against one of the common assumptions we hear a lot.
Okay, I'm listening.
Ready for this? URiM students actually reported having a similar number of role models compared to their non-URiM peers.
Wait, really? That's not what I expected. I feel like we hear all the time that URiM students lack role models.
Right, exactly. But hold on, before we celebrate too much, it's important to remember that while the quantity might be similar,
Yeah.
the quality of the role model experience could be vastly different.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about how many you have, but who they are, how you connect with them, and, how much you see yourself in them.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key finding in this study. While URiM students are finding role models, they rate them as significantly less ethnically similar to themselves compared to their non-URiM peers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In fact, the study found that only 13% of URiM students reported having a role model from the same ethnic background.
Wow, only 13%.
Yeah, while a much larger 68% of non-URiM students said their role models shared their ethnicity.
That's a huge difference.
It is a big gap.
It makes you wonder, even if URiM students are exposed to role models with amazing qualities, are they getting the full impact, if they don't see themselves reflected in those role models?
That's the question, isn't it? And it goes back to those symbolic outcomes we talked about.
Right.
Remember, it's not just about learning clinical skills or behaviors.
Yeah.
It's about that deeper sense of belonging, that I can see myself in their shoes feeling, which can be so powerful for motivation and resilience, especially when you're facing all the challenges of med school.
Oh, absolutely. I think that feeling of I can see myself in their shoes really resonates with a lot of our listeners out there.
For sure.
Think about your own experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Haven't you been more inspired by people who you felt some kind of connection with? People who you could relate to on a deeper level?
Absolutely. That shared connection, whether it's based on ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic background, or even just shared values, right? It can make all the difference in how impactful a role model is.
It's interesting, because this study really challenges some of the traditional thinking around role models. We hear a lot about the importance of having role models who are successful, who've achieved great things. But this research suggests it's not just about success, it's about relatability too.
I think you hit on something important there. It's about finding that balance between admiring someone's accomplishments and also seeing them as a real person, someone who's faced challenges and setbacks just like you.
This reminds me of something we often overlook in medical education, that whole idea of context.
Yeah.
We tend to focus so much on those universal qualities of a good doctor. But we forget that everyone's journey is different.
Right.
Shaped by their unique background.
And experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this study really highlights the need to consider that context, especially when we're talking about supporting URiM students. It's not enough to just say, here are some amazing doctors, learn from them. We need to be much more intentional about making sure that URiM students have access to role models who can truly understand their experiences, who can speak to their specific journey.
It makes you wonder if medical schools need to rethink how they approach mentorship and role modeling.
I think so.
Maybe instead of just focusing on connecting students with high-achieving physicians, they should also be thinking about creating more opportunities for students to connect with people who share their backgrounds, share their experiences,
I think that's a great point. Imagine if medical schools created mentorship programs that specifically paired URiM students with physicians from similar backgrounds. That could be so powerful.
It can make such a difference in helping those students feel seen, supported, inspired,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
This whole idea of supporting students is making me think about how we do research on role models, too.
Oh, yeah.
You know, those traditional studies that give students a checklist of desirable traits.
Right.
It feels so surface level now.
I agree with you. It's refreshing to see this study move beyond those checklists,
Yeah,
to dive deeper into the social dynamics, those less tangible aspects of role modeling.
totally.
It recognizes that it's not just about skills and knowledge,
Yeah.
but also about identity representation, a sense of belonging.
Okay, so we've talked about the framework, the importance of representation, and this interesting finding that maybe URIM students aren't lacking in terms of the quantity of role models.
Right.
But I'm curious, did the study find any differences in how URIM and non-URIM students actually experience those 4 stages of role modeling?
Yes, actually they did. And that's where some of the more nuanced findings start to emerge.
Okay.
So we look at the idealization stage. What's interesting is that both URiM and non-URiM students described very similar qualities. When asked to complete the sentence, a role model is someone who both groups focused on things like clinical skills, teaching abilities, and personal characteristics like empathy and having a good work-life balance.
So no big surprises there.
Yeah. Not really. It seems like both groups are looking for those same core qualities in their role models.
Okay, what about composition? That stage where students piece together their ideal from different sources.
Again, no significant differences there.
Oh, interesting.
Both URiM and non-URiM students reported having, on average, between 2 and 3 role models.
Okay, so they're not limiting themselves to just one person. They're drawing inspiration from multiple sources.
Exactly, just
Mhm.
like their non-URiM peers.
And what about behavioral outcomes, like learning clinical skills from their role models?
Both groups seem to value that aspect pretty equally, too.
Okay, so far so good. But I have a feeling things might change when we get to those symbolic outcomes, right?
You're right, that's where it gets even more interesting. Because that's where the idea of representation really comes into play.
Exactly.
And that's where we start to see a statistically significant difference emerge. The study found that students who describe their role models as inspiring, which is a key symbolic outcome, were also much more likely to report a higher degree of ethnic similarity with their role model.
Uh-huh. That makes sense to me.
Right.
Seeing someone who shares your background, you know, achieving great things, overcoming those obstacles, it just has to be more inspiring than seeing someone who feels different from you, even if they have all the right qualities on paper.
I agree.
It's that whole, if they can do it, I can do it too kind of feeling.
Exactly. And that's why the representativeness gap we talked about earlier is so crucial.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just have role models. You need role models who you can truly see yourself in.
Who embody that possibility of what you can achieve, right?
Absolutely. And that's a message that goes far beyond just medical education. It's relevant to any field, really.
Absolutely.
Any profession where you're looking for guidance and inspiration.
So true. So what this study is really saying is that medical schools and training programs need to be much more mindful of this.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they have mentorship programs, role models available,
They have to think about the diversity.
they need to think about the diversity within
Yeah.
those programs, for sure.
Exactly. It's not about ticking boxes or
Right.
meeting quotas.
It's about real inclusion.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, supported, where everyone has the chance to find those inspiring figures who help them believe in their own potential.
And speaking of inspiration, there's this really interesting point that came up in the study about idolization.
Oh, yeah.
The researchers found that some students, both URIM and non-URIM, would describe their role models with these almost superhero-like qualities.
Yes, it seems like this tendency to put doctors on a pedestal is pretty universal.
It is.
But here's the thing. The researchers caution against this over-the-top idolization.
It's interesting. Why would admiring someone too much be a bad thing?
Well, think about it this way. If you see your role model as this perfect, flawless being,
Yeah.
it can make your own journey feel impossible.
It's setting yourself up for disappointment.
Exactly. It creates the sense of, I could never be that good, or I just don't measure up.
Right, it's holding yourself to an impossible standard.
It is, and that's why it's so important to see your role models as relatable, as human,
Right.
not to diminish their accomplishments,
Right.
but to recognize that they've faced challenges, they've made mistakes, they've learned along the way, just like we all do.
I find myself thinking back to my own experiences,
Yeah.
and the role models who really had the biggest impact on me
Mm,
weren't the ones who seemed perfect.
right.
It was the ones who were willing to be vulnerable, to share their struggles, to let me see that they're human too.
I think that's so true.
Made them feel so much more real, so much more inspiring.
It's that human connection that really matters.
Yeah.
It's about seeing your role model not as a distant superhero,
Yeah.
but as someone who's walked a similar path, someone you can learn from, have a conversation with, and maybe even become someday.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing their achievements while also remembering they're on a journey, just like us. Well,
Exactly.
I think you've done a fantastic job guiding us through this study today. We've explored the framework, we've talked about the nuances of representation, and we've even challenged that idea of putting our role models on an unattainable pedestal. So as we wrap up, what would you say is the most important thing for our listener to take away from all of this?
You know, the biggest takeaway for me is that representation matters,
It does.
and it matters deeply. While just having access to role models might not be the biggest issue, especially for those from underrepresented backgrounds,
Mm,
having role models who truly reflect your identity, who understand your unique experiences,
yeah.
that can be incredibly powerful.
It's about feeling seen, understood, like you belong, right?
Exactly. And it goes beyond just individual success.
Right. It's about the bigger picture.
It's about creating a more inclusive and equitable medical field
Yes.
where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and reach their full potential.
So well said. And on that note, I have one final question for our listeners to think about as we end this episode.
Okay.
Think back to the people who have been most influential in your journey, your most significant role models.
Hmm.
Did they share your background, your identity? How did that or how didn't impact you?
Yeah.
And how might those experiences shape the way you mentor and support others?
That's a really powerful question.
It is something to really think about, right?
It is. Reflecting on those experiences can help us all become more mindful, more aware of the impact we have on others,
Oh, Lloyd.
both as mentors and as leaders in our field.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of role models in medical education.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.